Hi, I'm Scott Barry Kaufman from the Imagination Institute. At the Imagination Institute, we're dedicated to making progress on the growth, improvement, and measurement of imagination across all sectors of society. Toward that aim, we've been hosting a series of imagination retreats. These retreats consist of discussions with some of the world's most imaginative thinkers across a wide range of fields, from psychology to comedy to physics to spirituality, among others. We've had a lot of exciting discussions about how imagination operates within each field and how we can help young people develop imagination. We've also been discussing the importance of imagination in society more generally. What you're about to watch is edited footage of one of these imagination retreats. In addition, all the videos and reports of all the retreats will be available on our website at imagination-institute.org.
What do I spend a lot of time imagining? Well, I think in the big picture, my work is sort of meta-imagining in a way. A lot of it is about creating the circumstances in which people can be more imaginative, can be more insightful, can be more aspirational when it comes to futures. So one thing actually I would like to have the time, now that classes are over and grades are in as of midnight last night, one thing I would like to spend more time imagining, and perhaps we can do some of this together, is what a society would look like in which imagination were fully activated in everyone.
My name is Jermaine Castro. I am an easily distracted generalist. I am a distinguished fellow here at the Institute, which means I get a top hat and monocle. And I write and I give a lot of talks around the world, and my job is to try to imagine a better future. And so in religious studies, there's something called theodicies, which are essentially the justification for how can we have a just God in an imperfect and potentially evil world. So I've been thinking about neodicies, N-E-O, as the idea of how can we have hope for the future when things look so dismal. And so that's really been an underlying driver for a lot of what I've been doing, is trying to imagine, despite how scary things are right now, how can we imagine a world that is better?
On a related note, something that's been really capturing my imagination lately are these old pulp science fiction magazines from the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and they probably died out around in the 80s. Just as an aside, talking about theodicy and neodicy, Pain God by Harlan Ellison, a great story that touches on both of those. The editorial in this magazine I thought was interesting, talking about the role of imagination. So much of existence remains a mystery that the best approach to many experiences is best made through imaginative symbols and images. Fantasy is an art of equivalence. It sets before us existences other than but related to our own. And I think that's really cool. Thinking of alternate futures helps you think about the present and be more aware and cognizant of the things that are happening in your life. And it really helps you kind of think about what you're doing and the decisions that you're making.
Hi, I'm Tessa Finlove. I'm a researcher at IFTF, and a lot of my time is spent imagining how we can use futures thinking methodologies for peace building, explicitly because when you're actually building peace, you're trying to create a future that's radically different from the present and the past. And so it makes sense to provide a platform to actually think about what that future could be systematically. And so we've been, through the years, slowly kind of elbowing our way into the peace building field and getting some work in that area and trying to understand how we can use our methodologies in that space. And also spent a lot of time thinking about issues of poverty alleviation, and very recently how poverty is not about money, and we seem to struggle with imagining how poverty is more than just a lack of money, and there's power issues or psychological issues or social issues. It's so all-encompassing, and that a lot of the work that I've been focused on has really been around facilitating other groups to imagine their futures. And that there's a challenge that I'm currently finding around how to describe practical imagination, where it's kind of easy for people to imagine a future that's just completely not based on reality today. And it's very hard to create a through line so that people who are new at imagining futures are able to imagine a future that is radically different, but is still kind of based within today's reality, so that it becomes a practical imagination as opposed to just like some exercise that ends up nowhere at the end of the day.
Give us one of your favorite. Every futurist has a toolkit. What's one example of one of the things you do to dismantle any of these conditions?
Well, I'm going to show you one this afternoon. Actually, we're going to play a game that's about doing that. But I mean, well, let's see. Monofuturism. It's something I put up there. But to me, like, that's one of the greatest enemies of imaginative thought. And I mean, any version really of scenario thinking, which is probably, the central, not the only at all by any means, but the central kind of method that we operate in to try to diversify and ramify people's ideas about how the future could change, is directly about attacking that. There's not just one answer, because it hasn't happened yet.
I think, just seeing that there are actual, developed methods of working on forecasts. The one that particularly impressed me was the way that you look at possible scenarios having 4 different outcomes. Collapse, transformation, stability, and growth. I think, is that what they are?
Discipline.
Yes, it's very much like the card.
So that's where they're both Jim Data's work.
Yeah. So just that was like, a light bulb went off in my head, and it's kind of, like you said, the pluralistic future scenarios like that. That was like kind of it was there's a lot more to it than that, but that just kind of thought, oh wow, there's a system for doing this. It wasn't as freewheeling as I thought it might be.
See, I first started at Global Business Network, which takes a scenario-based approach, but a very different one from the alt future. So rather than having 4 prescribed, these are 4 categories that you will always be filling in, it's 4 different futures, but based on 2 dynamics of change, 2 very different dynamics of change, and you have to then deduce what those 4 futures would be based on each box's combination.
And you can pick any dynamic.
They can be any dynamics related to whatever issue you're trying to.
There's a recipe to get you to those too.
Yeah.
It's not just like pull them out of a hat.
Right.
Oh, yeah. But
European futures work is still primarily involved in that. Yeah.
And so, one thing that was a big lesson, that one of the first lessons I got from that was, you really want to avoid, it forces you to avoid the good, bad, middling set. It really gets you to think in very diverse ways about what the future might hold. So rather than just saying, okay, well, here's the future if things fall apart. Here's the future if we do really well, and then one we just sort of muddle along. And then maybe there's a transformation. This is all 4 of those have to be inclusive of all of those dynamics. Now here's each of those 4 futures in the GBN method is going to include aspects that are transformative and collapsing and disciplinary and growing.
Could you just pull off the top of your head what example of 2 forces or spectrums that you would be looking at that are not like?
Yeah, so it's often done with one is an internal, so internal resistance to change versus acceptance of change externally. Strong economic growth down against slow economic growth or economic decline globally. And so in a world where you have strong economic growth and a real acceptance of change, that's a world where you get people really trying, experimenting stuff. You'd say that each of those 4 boxes, you end up with different worlds that are still come from the same core point. And I don't think that's better than the four alt futures. It's a different method, and it's important to learn different methodologies.
But I think, regardless of what, there are a couple of dozen ways of generating scenarios, and the two we've just covered in the last 10 minutes are the two that, that in our classes we sort of train as like, you should know how to do this, and you should know how to do this, and then there's all these other things, and go forth and explore. But I would say that in those processes, there are two key things that you try to avoid being preemptive about. One is the preferability of those of any of the four. You don't want it to be sort of so obvious that this is the future you don't want to go to, and this is the ideal. Like you were saying, the Goldilocks thing of best, worst, and then muddle through. That's not useful. Right. What you want a four it doesn't have to be four, but in both of these cases it is four qualitatively different, really different stories that all have some winners and some losers. All have things to like about them and to deplore about them. So they're not beating you over the head with a kind of judgment already. Yeah.
Imagine you and your physicist friend talking about multiverses.
Yeah.
Right? Because this is exactly how they
branching
think.
paths.
That's how
it's
they
very
think.
compatible with this way of thinking. And so you want to avoid kind of being preemptive on the preferability spectrum. And then the other thing you want to avoid being preemptive on, and this kind of goes to your question and yours, Jim, about forecasting, is probability. Is you don't want this to be like, this is the future that's so wacky and out there that you don't really need to think about it, and this is the one that's really extremely likely. They should all be, possible, given if things happen to unfold in a certain way. So they all need to be entertainable and worth entertaining as possibilities. So you kind of suspend generally the conversation about probabilities until after you've had sort of a full exploration of what it would mean if things were to go in this direction or that.
For me, there's two primary reasons for working with futures thinking. One is to elicit new opportunities, new things to do, and the other one is to build resilience. And I think that the building resilience comes from multiple futures, perhaps more than one singular view. And like one example of this would be some scenarios from Kenya from 1989, where they looked at 4 different scenarios, either economic growth, stagnation, and political openness or political closure. And so the 4th scenario was economic stagnation with a closed political system. And they called it El Nino, and it described a scenario of internal conflict. And at the time, everybody said, this is crazy, why are you even asking us to think about this? This would never happen here. And then about 10 years later, that did happen. And so when you open up to multiple scenarios, multiple worlds, for example, then that forces you to ask the questions that you might not want to ask. Whereas if you focus on a singular scenario, you might not want it to be the super dire one, right? So if I'm working with peace builders, I'm not going to have them create one single scenario that says, okay, if you're still in war in 10 years, what does that look like? I would only do that if it's paralleled with another scenario that says, if there's peace, what does that look like?
The thing that we need to cultivate a curiosity about is that landscape of, and it has 2 faces, which we also saw in a lot of these ideas. There's, like what the actual possibilities are and what our perceptions of those possibilities are. And it's really hard to tell the difference. I mean, it's the epistemology, ontology question.
And it's like the difference between like finding certain signals and using confirmation bias to push an ideology, or else like looking at signals, like you said, and then applying it to a plural model.
I think a lot of futures work and the tools that we've talked about are kind of ways of exploiting our biases to counteract our biases. So like if you put on serially these different kind of lenses looking for evidence that things are moving in a certain direction, that's something that our brains are really, really good at doing. But so if you do that serially for alternative, mutually exclusive outcomes, then they may appear to cancel each other out, because it's like you find a bunch of signals that point in this direction, you find a bunch of signals that point in this other mutually exclusive and logically incompatible direction. But that's the point. There is more than one answer.
At least for me. lot of the stuff I like to think about, that I feel and need to think about, are the consequences. The anticipating consequences. So, thinking about what's happening with the climate, what's happening around, different emerging technologies, and not just, thinking about, wow, that'll be really cool. Here's the cool next gadget. But, thinking about, okay, what do we do with it? And what are the mistakes that we make and learn from? And so it's not so much I really want to see that, as we need to be paying attention to that.
Can you pre-make mistakes? Like, is that part of, can you pre-make a mistake? Like, instead of waiting 10 years, is that part of what you're doing when you think about the future? Like, trying to make mistakes in our imagination?
That's a good way of thinking about it, yeah.
Jake Dunnigan calls that a self-defeating prophecy.
Oh my God, that's so good.
Yeah, so it's like you prophesy it so that you can pay attention to not end up there. Yeah.
Right.
That's a good one.
I think in a similar way to Jamais, I'm focused on consequences. So, everything that I see sparks what's the consequence of this? Unlike Jamais, I don't think I'm as focused on, what are the ways that it could fail, or what are the ways that it could, I'm not looking for that particular kind of consequence, but there is a general sort of human, what's our human future? Wanting to get a picture of who are we and what are we doing here and what's our human future? And I think that's that question that's at the back of everything that I do.
This question of individual differences and what makes a good futurist is really interesting to me. Like, I read a lot of Abraham Maslow's writings, and he has a whole collection of unpublished essays on his visions of the future that he wrote in the 60s, and it's brilliant. It's the most brilliant stuff I've ever read. He didn't say I'm a futurist, but there was something that he had in his head, like he would say, like, he said at one point, he said, I don't know why I am the way I am. I don't know why I'm so obsessed every day with thinking about all possible situations, but I know that not everyone's like me, so we need to recognize that not everyone is like you guys, that these are not preoccupations that everyone has. What separates a person who has these visions where we read it and we're like, wow, this is really realistic, it's imaginative and realistic. So what's a good vision versus a not good vision?
Everyone know what a spiderweb graph is? Multiple sides and, okay, so.
No, I did not. Actually.
Okay, so, well, actually, how about if I draw it? This one is going to have 5 sides. So a good forecast will have some kind of logic, a through line, where you can understand how we get from here to there. Okay, so it's whether you call it internal logic, but the concept that there's a history. There will be complexity. That's what that says, complexity. It's just there's an underlying system to the forecast. There are multiple pieces that weave together. It's not just, let's take the future of cars and we only talk about cars. Or what's very commonplace is you look at the future of energy. You can talk to oil companies, the Energy Information Agency. They talk exclusively about, they make forecasts exclusively about energy. They don't take into account any of the other changes that are happening in the world. They'll be evocative. That is, they will cause, they'll evocative. And that evocative, they'll trigger and elicit an emotional reaction. You'll have a feeling response to it, a visceral response to it, not just an intellectual response. They'll be provocative. And that is, they'll make you upset. A good forecast can upset you or excite you or in some way change your opinion, change what you know. So it's not just information, but some kind of poking you in the shoulder.
Change what you think you know.
Change what you think you know. And they'll be stimulating. That is, a good forecast will make you start thinking about the implications, thinking about what else is in this world. So you read the forecast and then immediately start imagining, okay, well what else is going on here? How do I live in this? And so if you want to, you would chart out then, okay, this forecast that we're talking about is really high in the stimulation and provocation, but it was kind of dry and simplistic, but I can see the through line. And so, but this other forecast is, doesn't really make a lot of sense, but it is really complex. It makes me cry, but I don't care. And so basically, you would graph different forecasts in a way that reflect these five different categories. And that gives you a way to understand, okay, just how useful is a particular forecast. So
No, did you just come up with this today, or is this amazing?
You can immediately see how this could be applied to different forecasts and more importantly, the rationales that people generate as to why they would reject a forecast. If it's emotional, if it's evocative, well, it's not serious.
Oh,
This should be a business report. If it's complex, well, that's too confusing. I just need to know about the future of energy. I don't need to know about this other stuff about demographics and environment. If it's you're telling a history, that's too much. I just want to know the forecast at the end. I don't care how we get there. You can basically see how all of these can be reasons to reject.
Right.
If they're something done well, done at the far end, the good end of each of these five reasons, can actually be a reason to reject them from people who don't want to engage.
Yeah. The thing that I have not, it's an idea, it's not a scenario or artifact, but that I've not been as well received as I would like, that I'm still pushing on, is that when you ask people to imagine the future, it doesn't matter actually what they say, that it's the process and not the outcome. I'm constantly fighting with clients or partners who want to know, what did you learn? What was the outcome? What's the best idea that somebody came up with? As if it were that as a future thinking, we're all about crowdsourcing innovation or something. But I find that is really hard to divorce the outcomes, the ideas generated from the process of what is thinking about the future do for you and your creativity and your hope and all of that.
Frank Barron did this famous study where he brought the most creative people of his generation to University of Berkeley, to a renovated fraternity house to study them. And he brought Truman Capote there, and like the most famous writers, artists, scientists. And he found the one thing that really stood out amongst all of them was that when he showed them these Rorschach tests of like these images, the more ambiguous the image was, the more not complete the image was, the more excited the creative geniuses got, and they have a sample of non-creative geniuses who were so frustrated by the ambiguity. They're like, oh, I hate these pictures. But the creative people, each of these four things, this is what drove them to be creative people. It seems to be what drives you guys as well.
I think there's something in there about whether people, if they're told a story, if they take it literally, or if they can hold it as a metaphor for thinking about other things. I think that's often like a kind of, like you can you fall on one side of that or the other, and when people hold things literally, it's much more difficult to enter into that ambiguous space because it's like, it's constantly trying to pull it into a non-ambiguous space. Whereas when you hold things as metaphors, you have sort of like a raft for exploring that you can then jump off of as soon as the metaphor is not helpful anymore, rather than sort of like riding it into the earth, right? So I think that I observe that a lot in terms of how things are going, is whether it's taken literally or metaphorically.
Here we make artifacts from the future. Stuart does a lot of speculative design, but it's that just like by making something a physical artifact and presenting it to someone, the one that's coming to mind right now, like at our 10-year forecast last week, we had there was this whole kind of like genetically informed marketplace, and one of the things you could buy there was a TurboTax genetic exemptions kit. And so it looked just like the regular TurboTax kit, like great, beautifully mocked up, and on the back there's like all of these different genetic exemptions you can take if you've like tested for different genetic markers. And we had a few people like actually kind of pause and ask like, wait, is this, can I actually do this now?
That was real.
And like that's the biggest win for me, of like if you create a thing that doesn't exist informed by some vision of what the future could be, and then have people like actually kind of settle into the reality of what it would be like to live in a world where that thing was real.
That makes me think that what a lot of futurists are trying to do is move it back. So it's really a yearning for something to do now, but you're finding what it is you want to do now by looking at these possibilities in the future.
When you reached into your imagination to come up with ideas for future artifacts, what did you reach for? What was there? Anyone want to share that?
I kind of started with like hobbies or activities that I enjoy doing and other things that could augment or improve those experiences. So a lot of mine revolved around cycling and other things I would add to that experience.
Making cycling more awesome, because you know it, so you can kind of build out from there. Right. So I just wanted to ask, you each had different terrains that you adopted. What was it over here?
Insects.
Insects here?
The brain.
The brain and the zoo. Okay, so insects, the brain, and the zoo. Interesting kind of Cronenbergian intersection there. Okay, so how was it this time? How did you do in terms of the flowing of the creative juices? Was it easier, harder, about the same, but just a different flavor? What did you guys think?
I only got 12.
You only got 12? Oh yeah, well if this keeps up, you're only going to get 11 next time, Jemay, so that's a bit of a worry.
Somehow found it more fun because it wasn't, I had the freedom now to just do whatever I could within insects as opposed to like, what can my brain do?
That's really interesting. So the constraint made it more fun because you kind of knew the space you could play in, maybe.
Yeah, I found it easier to riff off a constraint.
How did you do, like, what do you think about the quality of the ideas you came up with?
With much more original ideas. Or maybe,
This time?
Yeah.
More original ideas?
Yeah.
Was that other people's experience or not so much?
I would disagree. Well, at least for me. Sorry. We had more overlap, which we obviously didn't have last time around.
Right.
That was
Right.
unrestrained. So more overlap. And I felt like because it was more restrained, there were places my mind wanted to go that were outside the conventional concept.
Where did it want to go that it couldn't go with the zoo?
Oh no, just thinking of the implications of like what happens with what are you doing with these? Are you talking about pets? Turning a lion into a pet with the right kind of tweak. Vegetarian lion.
Okay. Yeah, so you wanted to run down the implications of some of the ideas, not just generate a long list. Any other?
Yeah, part of that experience of having more overlap was that piece of like inhibiting the obvious answers. So like we had the brain, I feel like we each had some version of like a mind reading or brain implant technology thing as like the first kind of technology plus brain mashup thing that we did. And then once you kind of got those down and like cleared those out of your mental like congestion, then you can get out other ideas.
Right. Yeah, Jay Ogilvy used to co-founder of GBN, used to talk about emptying the bucket of the obvious. So, once you've done that, then the things that come out of the bucket starts to be a little bit more interesting. And with a bit more time and, reflection, perhaps we could get to higher quality things. But what I'm curious about is how changing the terms of the prompt change the way in which our imaginations operate and what it feels like to generate within that space.
There's a question we were planning on to ask you, I think it's appropriate to ask you now, is what are the limits of the human imagination when it comes to your thinking about the future? Can you think of any examples or any moments where you've been very frustrated in trying to imagine the future, and then how did you get past that block? What is the equivalent of writer's block for a futurist look like?
First is premature implication collapse.
Ooh, that's a good, what's that mean?
Basically, the concept that...
PIC, right?
I'm sorry? Yes.
That's PIC.
PIC.
That's a good one.
That people too quickly, they think about something that might happen or some kind of fantasy or imagined future and immediately come to the conclusion of what's going to happen from that. Mm-hmm. Immediately see a particular narrow, very near-term implication. Mm-hmm. Interestingly related to that, imagination monocultures. So basically what I found is working with people who are not in this field is they very often drive towards existing sets of ideas. So the Star Trek future, the Matrix future, where they basically grab onto an existing set of ideas and find it very difficult to get away from that monoculture.
So popular culture in a way.
So it's popular culture, but I think I'm using monoculture in a very distinct, very intentional way. That this is, what we find in ecosystems is that monocultures can flourish, but are extremely brittle. That if there's some kind of threat to them, something that doesn't fit, they can collapse.
Awesome. Okay, go ahead, Jimmy.
A lack of understanding or knowledge of the past, that is, not understanding how things got to where we are today, and therefore not understanding the dynamics of how things will go forward.
Right. Okay.
And so that can manifest as just not having any ideas. It also can manifest as coming up with completely unrealistic, implausible, not just implausible, but impossible kinds of outcomes. Ungrounded.
It's a value of knowledge.
It's a value of knowledge, but it's a value of understanding social, cultural, historical dynamics. That's I often refer to futurism as anticipatory history.
For me, the biggest limit that I hit is it's forgetting to remember that everybody's life can be so different, and that a lot of futurists are, for lack of a better word, privileged. And I've had to work very hard to include perspectives of people whose lives might be dealing with some of these, poverty and hunger and fear, daily threat of violence. And when we imagine the future, I think that's one of the biggest limitations in the field, and why we've been trying to diversify voices and inputs into it, because like Silicon Valley technology makers, you can have a bias towards your stage of life or your needs and wants as who you are. And I think that for a lot of, maybe I'm just projecting, but I think that that's something that a lot of people who work in futures have to constantly work to get past their own assumptions and realities, because different people, when you try to predict what people will do in the future, you have to think different gender, different socioeconomic, different religion. I failed at what people are deeply religious is something that I feel like I often fail to truly grapple with and acknowledge in my.
What you're hinting at too is that we struggle with creating futures, not just understanding how people with different experiences would react to our scenario or forecast, whatever it is, but creating stories about the future that are relevant to a very different audience. We were just in Saudi Arabia doing some research, and one of the interesting takeaways from that research was that young Saudis, they completely lack the ability to imagine an alternative path for their life because of the traditional society. So when they're trying to understand how to build up a private sector and how young people can have private sector jobs, and any young person who has the startup kind of idea, they actually lie about it, because family and friends will say, oh, you're dreaming too big. And so there's just no cultural kind of support for imagining something different.
And so I think, I've sort of had this confession hovering in the back of my head in relation to this retreat, that actually I don't feel like I'm a particularly imaginative person. I mean, I don't know on those measures that you shared with us, maybe in some ways, but I think to me, a large part of this work is about creating situations in which one's capacity is elevated. So whoever you are, be it as a practitioner and as a facilitator in that space, or or anyone else who comes along, a client or just an interested person, is to create the circumstances in which you can maybe make each other better. So I think one of the limits and affordances that enable are kind of two sides of the same coin. So the part of what I was hoping would come through with the game that we played earlier was that, not that the simple equation that the more stuff you add, the more imaginative you become. That's clearly not true. There's kind of a sweet spot, and then imagination begins to go down again as you become sort of overwhelmed with too many factors to synthesize. But I think using those limits to create situations where you can be more imaginative with other people. So you don't think of imagination as being a property of a single brain, but as a sort of a situated and multi-mind sort of phenomenon that you can enable and improve on. Like, that's kind of what I've been doing as an instructor.
I think the two sort of biggest ideas that came up was in terms of sort of cooperative imagination versus shared imagination. So thinking about using terms relatively loosely, sort of cooperative imagination is sort of the public imagination, where can be sort of as an idea is being imagined by enough people, acting as if it's true, and we talk about various examples of where that happens, then it sort of reaches a tipping point where it starts to manifest as real, right? And so that's sort of in the public sphere. And then on just the flip side of that is the sort of the pre-conscious, the collective unconscious notion of ideas whose time has come. So the idea of like many inventions like human flight sort of popping up at different points in the world around a similar time. And so we were interested in, among other things, like thinking about what is the relationship between that kind of pre-conscious shared material and then the public conscious shared material. And one of the ways to measure that, potentially, in sort of an experimental form, would be by looking at different mediums, and particularly we talked about VR, and which I'll talk about a little bit more in a second. But this idea of within any given medium, what is the relationship between sort of the intention of the person, which you could sort of see as the pre-conscious piece of it. What is the idea that's seated with them? What's the idea they're trying to express? Like, what is the intention of what is in their imagination to put out in the world? And then what is the actual manifestation and the qualities of that in terms of what they actually produce out of that, in that medium. And in many mediums, there's a pretty big delta there that involves things like skill at the given medium, your ability, your literacy, your ability to write, the craft of actually sort of articulating what's in your head, and then sort of what appears in the world. And this notion that virtual reality potentially represents sort of a closing of that gap, that there's sort of an ability to get a little bit closer between the intention of what you're trying to create and then the manifestation of what you produce as a result of that. And that, and we talked about sort of far future, maybe 30 years, maybe, who knows, but the potential to actually, the having zero gap there would represent the ability to sort of manifest immediately what's in your mind, right? So the ability to sort of use brain scans of what is the image you're holding in your mind and to manifest that into an immersive space. So we're obviously nowhere close to that, but as we sort of maybe get progressively closer to something like that, how can we start to measure sort of the feedback loops that are within that, the sort of between intention and manifestation? And so that's all sort of precursor. We had various sort of experimental models of how we might approach something like that. One of them was looking at virtual reality just in terms of its new affordances. So there is this ability to sort of create things with a variety of skill sets that are perhaps more accessible than in previous mediums, but also to sort of create a shared virtual space. So we were talking about Tilt Brush, the virtual reality thing where you can sort of paint with arbitrary materials and colors and whatever you want in a full 3D space and create sort of sculptures around you, but also within that shared space. So if you had multiple people, say, a dozen people in sort of a Google Doc style working together on the same shared virtual space, you could start to measure this idea of if they all are seated with the same idea of like home or the future, if they start in sort of randomly painting different things in that same space, do they eventually begin to align? And is there sort of a shared vision that can kind of emerge? Or are there things you could do to influence that collective sort of simultaneous work in order to have some alignment around what's emerging and use that to sort of try to sort of scope out what is that imagination, that shared imagination, that collaborative imagination activity?
I have found that it's often very difficult to get organizations to be willing to explore a scenario in which they're successful. In which, especially if they are a goal-driven organization, you come up with multiple scenarios, but in at least one of them you actually manage to carry out your goal. It's very, very difficult to get organizations to think about a future in which they win. And that's been true for environmental groups. It was true. I did a big project around the future of nuclear weapons. To get people to actually think through what would it look like to get to a world where nuclear weapons have been discarded.
Why?
I'm sorry?
Why is that?
They're not needed anymore.
Well, there's the cynical reason that they're not needed. It could be a fear that this just isn't realistic. It could be that it's not serious. It could be that it's not, well, if we succeed, well, then we don't have to worry about things anymore. And they don't want to think about the ones where they're not, where they don't have to worry about it. And unfortunately, I don't think that's really a useful way of approaching it, but it's a challenge. I wonder, have other people had that experience?
We're just not wired to pay attention to like the 1,000th time that the cat didn't get stuck in the tree. I mean, even in the exercise we did here, after talking about framing everything negatively, we framed this exercise very negatively, right? Like, what are the constraints? Like, they're all negative things up on the wall.
We are wired to constantly look for things that can go.
I think that might just be an evolutionary thing for us, right? That we're just looking out for the thing that's about to eat us.
I see a lot of similarities, and we'll take a break, between what we do in science and what you're doing, and the way you think about this, and the separability between predictability and preference. When I run regression models, that's a statistical method for seeing what are all these variables you put into the pot and which ones independently predict the dependent variable that you want to predict. Now, a good scientist doesn't prefer any of those variables. The things I put in that regression, I use my imagination. My imagination allows me to come up with generate all the potential predictors, but I'm not supposed to have a preference for any of them. So when you use this language, it made me think so much of what I do in my own field of as well. So for the psychologists, they said, like Jonathan Haidt, who's a psychologist, he's like, it's truth above everything else. That's all we should care about in the academy. I get the sense that here amongst futurists, like, it's going to be different. It's not truth above everything else. Are there certain sacred cows in the futurist field?
So ideas that everybody seems to hold. Values
that are absolutely essential to being a good futurist.
Can I read you guys something just quickly? So this is something Jim Data wrote 2 or 3 decades ago, and I often set it as part of the introductory reading for my students, because I actually find and let's call it an intro to futures, basically. To be a good futurist, you need the widest possible knowledge of the history and present condition of as many cultures as possible. You must know more than one culture and thus more than one language. The widest possible knowledge of all aspects of all the social sciences. The widest possible knowledge of current and emerging developments in the natural sciences and their emerging subdisciplines and transdisciplines. The widest possible familiarity with developments in engineering, especially electronics, genetics and nanotechnology, architecture and space sciences. The widest possible familiarity with philosophy, ethics, morals and religions, and the ethical discourse of as many different traditions as possible. The widest possible familiarity with law and planning. And active awareness of aesthetics and the aesthetic element of all aspects of life. A continuing experience of aesthetic expression in some, or preferably many, modes. Creativity, imagination, the willingness to think new thoughts, to make unmade connections, to be ridiculed, laughed at, and to laugh at yourself. The ability to synthesize, combine, invent, create. The willingness to be politically active, to test out new ideas on yourself first and while actually trying to create a better world, or some portion of it. The ability to try to anticipate the consequences of actions before you act, but also the willingness to risk failure and to learn from mistakes and criticism. Indeed, to seek out and provoke criticism, but to keep trying to do better and constantly to relearn what better might be. Insatiable curiosity, unbounded compassion, incurable optimism, and an unquenchable sense of humor and delight in the absurd. All of this can be described in one word: Eiglatzon, which is nostalgia spelled backwards and is a term coined by Gabriel Thackeray to symbolize the yearning for things to come. Revering the future without being disrespectful to the past, remembering that once it was all that was humanly possible, preferring the dreams of the future to the experiences of the past, always desiring to try something new, boldly to go where no one has ever gone before in all areas of human and non-human and soon post-human experience.
That is awesome. Did you write that?
No, that's Jim Data. That's my mentor and the guy. Data, D-A-T-O-R. He also said the quote that's on the wall on the window up there, facing outside. Any useful statement about the future should at first appear to be ridiculous.
You know, one thing that I often say is when I talk about these kinds of things, I know I'm going to be wrong. These aren't predictions, these are forecasts, and I know they're going to be wrong. I want to be usefully wrong. I want the ideas that I put out there to stimulate, and to trigger new thoughts for people so that they can see the world in a new way. And so it doesn't matter whether my forecast is 100% correct or 10% correct, if it manages to change the way people see the world. change what they anticipate about their own futures?
Individuals who naturally are inclined to ask why, perhaps more so than how. So who, and I think we all know people in our lives who don't like to question why around really fundamental societal things, right? It's much more comfortable just to accept that things are how they are and not really say, well, why do you feel that way? Why is it like this? Why are we doing this? Like, why do we behave like this as humans? So just being able to ask why and loving that as the ground of fruitful imagination.
I mean, just for the record, signals is probably one of those common sacred concepts that every futurist believes, which is that you can look around the present and find evidence of what the future might be like. So the famous phrase that everybody futurists must say at some point is, the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed, which is William Gibson quote. So I think signals that provoke imagination about what could come or what could be. The idea that there are weird and interesting and disruptive trends and forces and inventions and changes that are likely to affect what the future is like, and that your job is to be able to see them and maybe see them before other people.
Reminds me of, working in a foreign language that you don't really understand maybe half of what's being said or half of what you're reading or something, but there's a kind of patience with not knowing and willingness to kind of fill in the blanks. And I think that's also, it's interesting that we said earlier that knowing multiple languages and multiple cultures is part of that, because I think that there's something that we do with our brains that allows us to have big gaps in the sort of factual knowledge of something, and still be able to string that into a comprehensive or an understandable narrative.
I have a friend who's a brilliant physicist, a quantum physicist, and he thinks thoughts I really have no way to begin to fathom. And so I really enjoy speaking with him because he always asks great questions. And fairly early on in our friendship, he said, so, like, what's the most powerful idea in your field, in futures? And I'd never been asked that before, but the answer that came to mind immediately was the S in futures. The idea of the future being plural is not just the most powerful idea in the field, it is the point of departure from which everything else flows.
A few that we really kind of settled in on were comfort with cognitive dissonance. Comfort? Yeah, comfort.
Okay. They're comfortable with cognitive.
Yes,
okay.
yeah. Comfort with complexity, the love of deconstructing, asking why, comfort with uncertainty, having a systems perspective, which we also describe as pattern finding and seeing a process of change, and being intuitive. There's a lot of that, like, intuitive art in creating foresight. And then we were thinking about how it would be really interesting. We go with the assumption, and this is a lot of our work, creating citizens of the future, as we say. We go with the assumption that thinking about the future is a good thing, and that the skills you gain as an individual are good skills.
William Kelvin is a emeritus neurophysiologist at University of Washington. He's written a number of books, Cerebral Symphony, Conversations with Niels Ray. He has focused his life's work on the evolution of intelligence, the evolution of the mind. And one thing that he discovered is that, at least according to his analysis, there is a strong correlation between the parts of the brain that light up, that activate when you are thinking about the future, and the parts of the brain that activate when you are engaged in an act of ballistics, that is, trying to hit a moving target with a thrown object. Humans are the only species able to do that. You look at, if you've ever seen a video of like chimps or gorillas throwing things, they don't know how to throw. They can't hit things with a thrown object. You're not going to get a chimp hitting an antelope with a rock. And so there's an interesting, if that correlation is true, it's really an interesting underscore of your point that humans are intrinsically a forecasting species, because that is literally wired into our brains about that thinking about the future.